We believe that St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, is one of America's most important historic sites, where George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other colonial leaders met and, swayed by Patrick Henry's liberty or death speech, made a decision that changed the course of American history. It was at St. John's Church that the American Revolution found its voice, a voice that reverberates to this day. Ever mindful of this significant legacy, St. John's Church Foundation believes in these guiding principles. We are the guardians and stewards of this hallowed and sacred place. Our history is compelling and relevant. It informs our future. Our story is powerful, inclusive, educational, and important to share. Our story shows that civil discourse and differing points of view can bring people together and create positive change. And above all, our history shows with ultimate clarity that in the course of human events, one voice can change the world.
Liberty!
The mission of St. John's Church Foundation is to spark a global appreciation for understanding the role that Patrick Henry's liberty or death speech had in setting America on its path to liberty, and to ignite the public's commitment for preserving the site where it happened. So by being here tonight, you're helping us with our mission, and we thank you for your support. And now I'm very honored to and delighted to introduce our speaker. An expert in the fields of constitutional law and the Supreme Court, Dick Howard is the Warner Booker Distinguished Professor of International Law at the University of Virginia and the chief architect of the present Constitution of Virginia. Born and raised right here in Richmond, Virginia, on the north side, Professor Howard is a graduate of the University of Richmond and received his law degree from the University of Virginia. He was a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, and after graduating from law school, he was a law clerk for Justice Hugo L. Black of the Supreme Court of the United States. He's been counsel to the General Assembly of Virginia and a consultant to state and federal bodies, including the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and he chaired Virginia's Commission on the Bicentennial of the United States Constitution. Professor Howard has been twice a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and he received the University of Virginia's Distinguished Professor Award for Excellence in Teaching. And in 2001, he was the first distinguished visiting scholar in residence at Rhodes House, Oxford. Professor Howard is the author of numerous books and articles, including The Road from Runnymede, Magna Carta, and Commentaries on the Constitution of Virginia, which won the Phi Beta Kappa Prize. Professor Howard has briefed and argued cases before the state and federal courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States, and he's often consulted by other states and abroad. He's been named as one of the most respected educators in the nation, and the Greater Richmond chapter of the World Affairs Council conferred on Professor Howard their George C. Marshall Award in International Law and Diplomacy. And the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Library of Virginia have included Professor Howard on their list of greatest Virginians of the 20th century. The University of Virginia recognized Professor Howard in 2013 with its Thomas Jefferson Award, the highest honor given to faculty members at the university. And the award commended Howard for advancing through his character work and personal example the ideals and objectives for which Jefferson founded the university. So without a doubt, Professor Howard is the foremost constitutional authority in Virginia. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Dick Howard.
Thank you so much. Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to express my appreciation to St. John's Church for having me here in this rather remarkable building. And also, especially, I'm both touched and honored to be giving the Walter Greggy Lecture. That means a lot to me because he was a dear friend. We served together on the board at Montpelier, and a number of other common causes. We both cared very deeply about Virginia and its welfare. So to be here tonight under that auspices is really touching, and to have members of his family here too. Thank you so much for, excuse me, for coming. Of course, we're in the very place where the famous liberty or death speech was made. I don't need to riff on that. You all know that history. It was not very long later, the next year, May of 1776, that the Virginia Convention met in Williamsburg, and at that convention they'd set to work on the first Virginia Declaration of Rights, the famous Declaration of Rights, and on the same day instructed Virginia's delegates in Philadelphia to introduce the Resolution for Independence. Well, that of course set in motion the age of rights, the age of constitutions. And what fascinates me, and I want to talk about a little bit tonight, is how those ideas circle the globe. I mean, you're probably, all of you are sort of history buffs, I expect, and know a good deal about the founding period. You'd be intrigued to know, I think, that the ideas that were being hatched and developed and nurtured here in Virginia and in America generally resonated so well in places like France and other parts of Europe. The Revolutionary era must have been an amazing time to be alive, because there was a kind of energy and exuberance in that period. People who were part of it knew that history was being made, and they were innovating in ways that fascinated the Europeans. For example, it was here in America that we perfected some way to actually create constitutional supremacy, an idea which the French had not yet quite perfected. I mean, now, I grant that public life in America was very different from public life in Europe. We had no monarchy, we had no heavily established church, we had no enormous bureaucracy, we had no privileged class. There were a lot of differences, but despite those differences, the French in particular and other Europeans were following very closely what happened in America, because I think they knew this was the dawn of a new era. Things were happening that really had no precedent, and in particular, ideas that the philosophes and others had talked about, ideas like liberty and equality, were actually being put into concrete form in America. Well, one aftermath in France itself was the writing of the French Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, 1789, and if you lay that side by side with the Virginia Declaration of Rights, you see the paternity. You can see how much of the Virginia document carried over through people like Lafayette and others into the French Declaration. Equally fascinating, I think, was the debate that took place in the French National Assembly. When they set to work on France's first constitution, which took effect in 1791, the debates involved two factions, one radical, one moderate. The radicals looked at and cited the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1790, which was a very democratic document, a unicameral legislature, and the more moderate faction cited the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was more of a centrist document. So it's hard to imagine the French today quoting American examples for anything. The French, as you know, are very, very proud, but in the 1790s and that period, they didn't seem to mind. Now, history took a very different path in these two countries. I mean, we in this country evolved separation of powers, checks and balances, and the like. The French, in their constitutional path, took a much more radical direction, and so there was divergence between what was happening there and what was happening here. Now, I'm intrigued. There are many ways that constitutional ideas travel to get from one place to another, and American ideas have taken that trip through various modes. Sometimes it's an appreciation or esteem for the American experiment itself, thinking that it was just a good model. Sometimes it's more imposed on people by way of colonization or in the aftermath of war. So there are many ways that American ideas have gotten abroad. To give you one or two examples, when the revolutions of 1848 spread throughout the continent of Europe, they broke out in a number of places. In Germany, liberals, lawyers, and others were fashioning a liberal constitution, and uppermost in their mind was the American experiment. There was a professor, a famous professor at Heidelberg, for example, Professor Mittermeier by name, and he said, I'm going to quote him, "I ask you, gentlemen, to turn to the experience of America. Let us follow the American example, and we shall harvest the most splendid fruit." Now, so they incorporated both federalism and judicial review into that liberal constitution. It never actually took effect. Because the conservative powers, Prussia and Austria, came down upon it and put an end to it. But the example was there as part of Germany's constitutional memory, so that when the present Constitution of Germany was written, the Basic Law of 1949, it actually incorporates federalism and judicial review in forms that remind you very much of 1848, and therefore, in turn, America. Another interesting story is the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War, when America, as you know, defeated Spain, we acquired the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And there was some little debate about maybe making the Philippines a state, but that didn't play out. But this was the period of manifest destiny, the period of really American imperialism. We didn't have colonies as the other countries had, so we were embarking upon that kind of experiment. Senator Albert Beveridge, who was in the debate in 1898, said this. He said, "American law, American order, American civilization, and the American flag will plant themselves on shores hitherto bloody and benighted. God has marked us as his chosen people, henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world." That's pretty powerful language, and a lot of people talked that way roughly 100 years ago. Well, Americans set out in the Philippines to create a system of public education, a gradual move towards self-government, the importation of American jurisprudence and the like. So, excuse me, in 1934, the Filipinos had a constitutional convention producing a constitution looking a lot like, not surprisingly, the American Constitution. One other story to add to this galaxy is Japan after World War II. When America and its allies were victorious, Germany, of course, had surrendered first. Then, when Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped, unlike Germany, there was actually a government still in power and in existence in Tokyo. So MacArthur, who was in effect the shogun, in effect, he was the supreme commander in charge, wanted the Japanese to write a post-war liberal constitution. Well, it became quickly apparent that they weren't going to do much but kind of fiddle with the old constitution. So MacArthur simply turned to his military government team and said, "Write me a constitution." Well, I never knew MacArthur, but I did serve in the Army, and if he'd said, "Howard, I want a constitution," I would have said, "Yes, sir. When would you like to have it? Tomorrow morning?" Well, it was almost that quick. The military government team wrote a constitution in 7 days. I guess maybe they rested on the seventh day. I don't know, but that's pretty quick. The Japanese were appalled because they thought they would be the ones to write the new constitution, but they were under military occupation. They didn't have a lot of say in the matter. So this American Constitution, this American document, was put into effect in Japan. Well, that was 1946. You would think after the American occupying troops left and Japan was able to control its own affairs, that they would scrap this American Constitution and write one of their own. And the amazing thing is, to me at least, that same Constitution is still in force and effect in Japan. It has never been amended, though there's some talk about amending Article 9, which is the peace article. But so you say, well, how could that be? The two cultures are so different. How could an American document still be in effect in Japan? Well, I think the answer is the Japanese, who are very good at these things, have in effect domesticated the Constitution. So the practice and customs, the way it's worked out, the way it actually is used by the Japanese reflects Japanese culture and not American. Well, as you probably know, after World War II, there was a powerful spread throughout the globe of liberal constitutional democracy in a number of places. In the 1970s, for example, the dictatorships in the Mediterranean became democracies: Greece, Portugal, Spain. In the 1980s, democracy came to countries like Chile and Argentina, so South America saw a good deal of change. And then in an era in which I personally became involved, 1989, many of you remember the amazing things that took place in a matter of months or even weeks. In Poland, the rise of solidarity, the Berlin Wall came down, and there was the collapse of communist regimes in a number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I'd never spent any time in that part of the world. Actually, that's not true, but I'd never spent professional time there. So I was approached by the State Department asking if I would meet with a delegation from Hungary, Hungarian drafters who, this was 1988, before the wall had come down. This drafting team wanted to write a new constitution because I think the Hungarian communists saw what was coming. They wanted to sort of ride it out in effect. So these Hungarians came down to Charlottesville. I spent 2 days with them talking about, well, what do you do when you write a constitution? And I must say that having worked with the Virginia drafters, that was the first time I worked on the making of a constitution. And I can tell you, after you worked with the Virginia legislature, Albania holds no terrors. I mean, I have been roughed up by professionals, so I was ready for Hungary. So I went to Hungary, and then I began to work with some others as well. And what I quickly realized, I studied history in college, that if I was going to work with a country, I needed to know something about that country's history, its traditions, its culture. I couldn't just waltz in there as an American and say, oh, you want a new constitution? Well, here it is. We the people of, fill in the blank. It doesn't work that way. So I did some reading before I went over, and as a wag once said, that Central and Eastern Europe carries more history in its knapsack than it can consume locally. And things seem to burst out of that part of the world. So I was at dinner one night in Budapest with some Hungarian friends, and I was asking about the revolution of 1848. And there was a cafe called the Cafe Pillvox, in which the liberals and reformers and folks met and talked about liberal ideas. And I was just curious to know if this cafe still existed. Maybe it had a different name. Maybe it wasn't a cafe anymore. But being from Richmond, I mean, I grew up with historic buildings. What can I say? So I wanted to see this Cafe Pillvox. And when I asked about that, a woman sitting at the table, a Hungarian woman, pointing to me, turned to her friends and said, "There, I told you he was Hungarian." Well, as far as I know, I don't have any Hungarian blood. But, I mean, the more you get the point that you'd have to be Hungarian to care about the revolution of 1848. They just assumed a foreigner wouldn't care about that. So that's a fairly simple story, is simply one of a number of incidents that kept reminding me I had to stay close to the ground. Don't come in with some fancy ideas, but learn what local people think they want to do and then maybe help them achieve that goal. Now, during this period of post-communist constitution making, some principles of liberal constitutionalism were in play. Free and fair elections, a free press, independent courts, checks and balances, and constitutional supremacy are among the most important ones. And those, to my mind at least, were things that in one form or another needed to be part of a good constitution, a liberal constitution. Also, the framers borrowed from international norms and indeed from some Western constitutions. Now, about that time, a scholar named Francis Fukuyama, you may know his work, he wrote an interesting book called The End of History and the Last Man. And in that book, he predicted and I'm quoting him, the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Sounds a little bit like Hegel and his sort of philosophy, but the idea was that liberal constitutional democracy was spreading in a way that it might take time in some places, China maybe a little bit longer in places like that, but it was all headed in the right direction. Well, that was 1992. And you do not hear people talking that way today. It's just not the way we think. How different the world looks 25 years later. That widespread optimism, that sort of euphoria, as it were, about liberal democracy has been undermined by nationalism, by populism, by xenophobia, anti-globalism. There are lots of forms it takes, but you read the papers and watch television and follow the press, and you know what's going on in China and Russia and Turkey, and even in the United Kingdom, Brexit is a sort of a first cousin of this phenomenon. So Hungary in particular, because I did spend some time there, is an example. In the period around 1989, I met Viktor Orban. That's the present prime minister of Hungary. In those days, he was a 26-year-old graduate student and a liberal, in the sense that he wanted the Soviets out and wanted the Hungarians to control their own fortunes. Well, he experimented in politics over the years. Finally, he decided that where he belonged was on the far right of Hungarian politics, a very nationalistic politics. And so the prime minister in office today is a very different man, at least in what he's talking about, than he was when I first met him some years ago. He says the post-war liberal consensus is at an end, and that Hungary is now what I think he may have invented this term, that Hungary is an illiberal democracy. Still a democracy, but one rather different from what people were imagining in the years right after 1989. He sees himself as a buffer against bureaucrats in Brussels, against people like George Soros, and against migrants from other parts of the world. So his journey is a rather remarkable transformation in personal terms, but it also reflects, I think, what's happening in that part of the world. It's a reminder of how the trend towards liberal democracy is not irreversible. It can be turned back. It can be undermined, as I think is happening in Hungary. So how does he accomplish that? This is not a dictatorship. I mean, this is not Stalin's Russia or something like that. They still have elections. They are free but not fair, if I may make that distinction. So he proceeds by undermining the media. The media has become a captive of the state. Checks and balances have largely evaporated. The Constitutional Court, which in the 90s was a very strong independent body, has now been undermined. All the justices on that court now were appointed by Orban's party. There's Crony capitalism. Friends of the regime get cut in on the good contracts. Elections, there are elections, but there's gerrymandering. No, we're not a stranger to that in this country. So what I think people like Viktor Orban are very good at playing on history. And in Hungary's case, Hungarians think of themselves as victims. After World War I, with the Treaty of Versailles, the Trianon Treaty, Hungary lost about 2/3 of its territory to surrounding countries, so that there are probably 1 million ethnic Hungarians who live in places like Romania, Serbia, neighboring countries. And so Orban reminds Hungarians of how badly they've been treated by other people and how they're not appreciated. Just a short word about their neighbor, Poland. I also spent a fair amount of time in Warsaw when they were at work on their constitution. And I used to cite both Hungary and Poland as success stories. That they really were brought into the orbit of the kinds of things that we perhaps take for granted in constitutional government in this country. But there's been the rise of the so-called Law and Justice Party. And so very much like Orban, that party in Poland sees Poland as an illiberal democracy as well. And some of the same things I talked about, undermining the judiciary, captive press and the like, take place in Poland. And the Polish story, I think, is interesting because countries have mythology. I mean, we have it, and I don't mean that in the sense of making up stories, but things they consider to be the essence of the founding, of the very nature of that country. And in our country, the Constitution may come kind of close to being that part of our mythology. But in the case of Poland, they think of themselves, a 19th century Polish poet described Poland as being the Christ of Europe. And by that he meant that over the centuries, Poland has been on the front line of Christianity against the Ottoman hordes and the like. And when the Ottomans were turned back at the gates of Vienna, it was a Polish king who actually led the Christian forces. So this is part of Poland's history. And they say, here we were on the front lines and we get no respect. People don't appreciate what we did. We are victims. Poland, indeed, you may know from history, it disappeared from the map of Europe in 1795, was carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and didn't reappear again on the map of Europe until 1918. And yet the idea of Poland survived all that time. And that's one reason I think they cherish it so much today. Now, let me bring this together. I mentioned Poland, I mentioned Hungary. It's not true in every country, but there are examples in other continents of developments that I think you would say resemble what was happening in Hungary and Poland. And among the factors at play is nationalism. And this is a powerful force, the notion that you have a nation that has a special place in the world, and that if you're a nationalist, you want to control your own country's destiny. And if you get the impression that somehow that control is slipping away, the nationalists they appeal to a glorious past, they rail against the problems of the present, they paint a picture of a happy future for the country. So nationalism, I think, is one of the forces. Second one is populism. Very difficult to define what you mean by it, but I think you have a general sense of it. Populist, I remember when the Brexit debate was going on, and when the High Court in Britain, in the UK, said that the Parliament had to be the one to implement the Brexit agreement, then the popular press broke out proclaiming the judges there to be enemies of the people. I mean, that's the kind of language that was used in the 1930s in Stalinist Russia, but the Brexiteers were using it in the UK. So a populist appeal to sentiments like that the elites are corrupt, they're out of control, that immigrants are part of the problem, that there are sinister conspiracies, and that protection is needed against those forces. Finally, and here I get, I think, to the heart of my concern about some of these trends, and that is the rise of authoritarianism. Now, as I say, I distinguish that from dictatorship. That's a different animal. That's Hitler in Germany. That's Stalin in Russia. But authoritarianism includes some of the following earmarks, I think, to distinguish it. One is to see an election as a mandate, so that checks and balances are rejected. If the people have elected you, you speak for the people, and other courts and the like are not meant to stand in the way. Secondly, there's the economy, an oligarchical control of major parts of the economy. There's control of the media, either by having the state take over media or by putting people who prefer the regime's way of looking at things in control of the media. There's a 10 for you lawyers, there's a kind of curious kind of rule of law in these countries. And that is to say that law is used in an oppressive way. That vague laws, they'd be under our constitutional void for vagueness, but vague laws are put into place so that if there are critics of the regime, you can prosecute and put them in jail in a legal fashion. I think, for example, of a law that's on the books in Turkey. It makes it a criminal offense to offend Turkishness. Now, you think, I mean, what in the world does that mean? It means whatever the regime wants it to mean, right? To offend Turkishness, that may be criticizing Erdogan or whatever it might be. And that's the device. So there are a number of devices that these authoritarian regimes use. And this is perhaps too dramatic to say it's in effect that democracy as we know it is under siege in many parts of the world. I described in brief for you the spread of liberal democracy in various parts of the world in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But the last few years are showing a pattern that I find disturbing, and that is that there's a Freedom House in New York keeps track of democracies, their rise and their fall. And for the first time since World War II, there have been more reversals than gains. Now that's not immutable. One hopes that that will change. But what we're finding is repressive countries, China, Russia, become more repressive. You remember the notion at one time a few years back that if China developed a middle class, then they would become democratic? Well, you and I know that that has simply not happened. Then some democratic states become illiberal, and that is the example I've given of Hungary and Poland. So these are examples chosen. There's no universal judgment I can make except to suggest that the call that Patrick Henry and others of that generation made, a call for liberty, is something that has to be constantly preserved. And I think it makes you think about, if there's a civics lesson in all this, it makes you think about fundamentals. What are the fundamentals of liberal constitutional democracy? In the Anglo-American world, they have roots that go all the way back to Magna Carta, back to the 13th century and beyond. They have other counterparts in other parts of the world. I think a second conclusion I would draw is that how constitutional principles do travel. It is possible to learn from the examples and experience of other countries and there's a reinterpretation that goes on of constitutional principles. They're not static. I mean, there are grand designs like the 14th Amendment's equal protection, due process clauses, but every generation has to pour meaning into those concepts. Thirdly, I think, and this is one of the lessons that I felt very strongly from other countries' experience, and that is ultimately constitutions are contextual. And by that I mean they're not all just blank pieces of paper. They do have to be grounded in the traditions, the customs, the mentality of a particular people or a particular country. Fourthly, I hope this is clear from my remarks, that liberal constitutional democracy, as appealing as we find it, is not inevitable. I mean, look at how much of human history was quite without it. It's been a fairly short period of time since the 18th century to the present time that we've been able to enjoy the blessings of liberal democracy. And I think one of the lessons of the revolutionary, the founding period, I mean, Patrick Henry made this patently clear, was that these principles have to be continually defended and fought for. They really have to, they cannot be taken for granted. They have to be re-examined. You want to think about those principles. Do they really work? Do they really work for us in our own time? And to be re-articulated. No one has said it better than George Mason of Fairfax County. He was the principal author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the one I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. And that Declaration of Rights, still part of Virginia's Constitution, virtually word for word as it was, still has this language of George Mason, and that is the following. He said, "No free government, nor the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles." A frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. I mean, to me, that's telling language, and I think it's one of the lessons that the founding generation has given to us. Thank you very much. So I understand there's time for unless I've beaten you into the ground, that there's time for questions and answers, comments from you all. And I think there's a mic here which she can bring around to people who do have questions.
Dick, I identify with much of what you've said. I became associated in the early 1990s with a group that went throughout the world to places that were looking for what I call capitalistic democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Places like Russia, China, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. And these people were eager to adopt what they would define as the American dream. We don't seem to be there anymore. There's not that urgency, that passion for adopting the American dream. Question first, what do you think caused that? And secondly, how do we get back on the path of the American dream?
Boy, I tell you, I didn't plant that first question. I was hoping for a softball question, you know, the kind of question that makes the speaker look good. But Joe Grills has put his colleague Dick Howard on the spot. And by the way, I compliment you for the work you did during that time. That was very important. I deal with the constitutional side, not so much the economic side. Other Americans and other Westerners were also traveling, like yourself, to help people move from command economies like socialism or communism to something of a more free enterprise kind of thing. And I think it was easier said than done. I think it's, I don't know, is it like courtship where you paint this beautiful picture and then maybe things in real life don't turn out to be quite that way, that the road is bumpier than a young couple may suppose. I think that was as part of the answer to your first part of your question, is that I think the notion that you could simply abandon the old way and adopt the new was easier, as I said, than done. For example, I think there was something called shock economics that they tried out in Poland, and that was to say just completely shutting down the old factories and opening up, selling them wholesale in effect to new owners and the like. So one of the problems that I think was taking place was probably a couple of things. First, the lack of real understanding of economics, of capitalist economics. It was maybe a theory. And the other is that I called it crony capitalism in Hungary, the notion that it was the old, typically communists who waited for these companies and these enterprises to fall into their laps, and they took them over. So it was, I think they call it the kleptokratura. The old thinkers became capitalists in effect. Well, they were not really capitalists. They were just making a lot of personal fortune out of it. So corruption and lack of transparency is a big part of the answer to what you say. I mean, in this country, we have capitalism, but we also have regulations in place to protect people like consumers of banks and all the rest. We don't just let it go for broke, as might have happened in the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century. We've tried to put some control mechanisms in place. They're, of course, hotly debated, but the idea is that you have something to prevent people from just going off in some crazy direction. And in these, at least in the former communist countries, you don't have this kind of, I mean, transparency and lack of corruption are really, I think, part of the problem. Your second question was, what do we do about it? Wow. What do we do about it is, to me, that's the unanswerable part of the question. I'm not an economist. I don't deal in these things. I think we have to accept, let's take something like reunified Germany. When East Germany became once again reunited with West Germany, the West German government poured immense amount of money into the East, immense amounts, on the theory that they would, I gave some lectures at East German universities at the time of the transition, and the dean of the law school there said that with each entering class, he could see the changes in attitude from the slightly older students, because different ideas were in the world, in the air. So the West German government thought that if they put enough money into it, they could basically bring the two parts up together. Today, I think in terms of mentality, what used to be East Germany is still different from West Germany. The people there talk about nursing grievances. Years have now passed since the communist era, and a lot of people don't remember it. And now as they become to sort of mythologize communism, we think that's, how could they do that? Well, that was the way things used to be, and now they've seen things are not the way they wish they were, and so they're looking for something different. So, I mean, I'm not answering your second question at all well, but I mean, it's a huge challenge to know. I think I find the constitutional side challenging enough. I think the economic side may be even a further reach. But thank you for a great question. Good start. Who else do we have who'd like to ask a question? Okay, thank you.
I wanted to ask this question in an unideological light. But it's interesting in times like ours, in times in the past when there have been stresses that have been put on our constitutional system, that those stresses tend to show the strengths of the system, but also the weaknesses in it, because obviously our system isn't perfect. So I'm curious as to what you see today as far as the strengths that are emerging and the weaknesses that are showing in our constitutional system.
Wow, another softball question. Wouldn't you say? Could you hear the question? All right. Strengths and weaknesses perceived in today's constitutional system. And I think you were referencing the notion that we've had over the years, from the founding period to the present time, the appearance of strengths which got us through the times of stress and turmoil. I think you're on the right track, because it seems to me one of the lessons of American constitutionalism is it starts with an imperfect compromise among people who were not only thinkers but also politicians. They were in Philadelphia to get a job done. They had to broker a deal. They had to go back and sell it to their several states. It had to be ratified by those states, and they had varying interests. So some things, slavery, not mentioned in the Constitution, was, in a sense, 3/5 of persons. I mean, euphemisms like that. Not something, we wouldn't say that was an admirable compromise, and yet if they hadn't done it, they might not have had a constitution. So compromises were made, and yet they're side by side with absolutely bedrock principles that we profit from today, principles like the importance of having an independent arbiter, namely the Supreme Court. The notion that the Constitution is supreme over ordinary laws, and that's a very basic principle. The addition, this was part of the compromise, as you know, the Federalists almost lost it because they did not have a Bill of Rights. And so James Madison and his friends said, okay, just ratify the Constitution and we'll add a Bill of Rights at the first Congress, which of course, as you know, they did. And so the Bill of Rights brings into play a list of principles. We today might have a slightly different list. You might add some or subtract some, but it's an amazing list of fundamental rights, which through the 14th Amendment now applies to the states as well. So I don't want to get into a debate over originalism. You know, the Justice Scalia and the notion that you read and apply the Constitution as it was understood publicly at the time it was adopted. That's kind of in one sentence a definition of originalism. I appreciate the effort. I applaud the sentiment of those who hold to originalism. I think in practice it's difficult to make it work. My suspicion is the framers had in mind that they put in play the framework, a constitution, a set of principles, which would have to be adapted to local circumstance and conditions from one generation to the next. Something like due process, equal protection, cruel and unusual punishment. These are not static concepts. And I personally think that Madison and the others understood that they would take on gloss and meaning as time moved along. And that, to me, is one of the secrets of the answer to your question, that you've got documents, state documents like the Virginia Declaration, federal documents like the Federal Constitution and Bill of Rights, which set out some operating principles, some lodestars, if you like, which are not self-revealing, but they point the way. And then as we run into problems, I mean, Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil Rights Movement, I mean, think of the bumps along that road. And yet, I think there are times one sort of gets pessimistic, but I personally am fundamentally optimistic because if we've survived all of that, I think we can continue to do that. So I guess that's my take on what I would say is a very good question. Other questions? One more question.
As we're all Virginians here tonight, John Marshall, I think, is giving credit for giving the oomph to federalism in the Constitution, and his counterpart, if you will, Thomas Jefferson, they didn't think along the same lines. Could you comment on the way those two conducted themselves?
Oh my goodness. I think to answer that question, I'll ask a show of hands. Do you like Thomas Jefferson or do you like John Marshall? And whichever side has the most votes, that's the guy I think I'll go with popular opinion on that one. I mean, isn't that, think of starting with those two, John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson, and then add some of the other major figures of the founding period, like James Madison, like Patrick Henry, on, and you get what a range of ideas and views and values they had. I mean, you think they would have come to blows over arguing some of those things. And as you know, Jefferson and Marshall were distant cousins, and like some cousins didn't get on too well. And I mean, take a case like Marbury versus Madison, which we remember today because it lays down the principle of constitutional supremacy. But part of that opinion is a lecture to Thomas Jefferson on his obligations and of office. Can you imagine when he saw that opinion, how he must have, what is John Marshall up to? You know, how could, you know, so it got personal at times. But what I like about that period, my goodness, what an amazing period the founding period were. And I think we were so fortunate, we today, to have had people at that time who had the vision, the capacity, the good sense, even if they disagreed on things, as Jefferson and Marshall did, to really recognize what the fundamental issues were. They were not talking about fringe matters. They were getting to the heart of it. And I think that it's almost like I teach at the law school. Wouldn't I love to have students as vocal and as articulate and of as disparate views as people like Jefferson and Marshall, because just the exchange of ideas would be so electric and so wonderful. And I think out of all that debate, I think it was a kind of conversation among first-class minds that produced the system we've got. And I think, I mean, that's, to me, despite all the differences they had, it was their ability to talk about fundamentals. And I think at base, they talked about things which did divide them, but I think at base they had more of a common ground than their conversation might have accepted. I think we have that today. And that's why no matter who's president or who controls Congress, who's on the Supreme Court, I think those fundamentals will survive, if not intact, I think pretty well. Thank you for that question. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Professor Howard. We have a tradition here. If you give a Walter Craigie speaker, give a lecture, you get a lousy T-shirt. So.
All right. So this.
Wear it with pride. History nerd.
History nerd. And don't you think this will go well with my NCAA cap?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
These are Patrick Henry's glasses, by the way.
Oh, I love it. That's so great.
Yeah. Thank you all
so
for being
much.
here, and thank you, Professor
Thank
Howard.
you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Gentlemen, Virginia must be prepared.
How can one be discreet, sir, with British cannon aimed at short range?
That is in New England, Mr. Henry. This is Virginia.
Those ships could soon be in the Chesapeake Bay.
We must not confront, sir.
Can any honorable man scruple or hesitate to take up arms to protect so precious a thing as liberty?
I know of no way of judging the future, but by the past.
Give me liberty, or give me death.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Second Virginia Convention of March 1775.